Most people think attraction is built through effort, words, and constant presence, but psychology reveals something far more uncomfortable. The strongest emotional shifts don't happen when you speak more, they happen when you stop. Silence doesn't end connection, it exposes it. And once you understand how absence, emotional independence, and silence reshape the human mind, you realize why ignoring her changes everything without you saying a single whoa. When attention is always available, the human mind slowly stops registering its value. This happens not because the attention is unwanted, but because certainty removes emotional tension. The brain is designed to notice contrast, not consistency. When someone knows they can access you whenever they want, your presence becomes predictable, and predictability weakens emotional impact. Ignoring her works because it interrupts this pattern and forces the mind to reassess what was previously taken for granted. Absence does not create value on its own. It reveals the value that was already there but had become invisible through overexposure. This reassessment is rooted in basic psychological conditioning. People assign importance to what feels limited or uncertain, not to what feels guaranteed. When you withdraw attention, the emotional system shifts from passive consumption to active evaluation. She begins to notice the change not because of manipulation, but because her emotional expectations have been disrupted. The mind automatically asks questions when patterns break. Where did that energy go? Why does this feel different? What changed? These internal questions are the beginning of renewed emotional engagement. Another important layer is emotional contrast. Presence only feels meaningful when absence exists. Constant interaction flattens emotional peaks, while strategic distance restores depth. Ignoring, when done naturally, introduces space where emotions can stretch and expand. In that space, memory becomes stronger. Past interactions feel more vivid. Moments that once felt ordinary gain emotional weight. This is how value is reconstructed, not through pressure, but through reflection. It's also important to understand that value reassessment is not driven by fear of loss alone. It is driven by awareness. When someone steps back without hostility or explanation, the mind becomes alert. Attention sharpens. Emotional sensitivity increases. This heightened awareness makes even small signals feel significant. A simple message after silence carries more impact than dozens sent during emotional overavailability. However, this effect collapses if the withdrawal is reactive or resentful. Emotional value cannot be reclaimed through punishment or silent protest. The power of absence comes from emotional stability. When you disengage calmly without resentment, you communicate self-possession. That energy signals that your attention is a choice, not a reflex. And when attention is clearly a choice, it becomes psychologically valuable again. Ignoring her works not because silence hurts, but because silence removes emotional noise. It clears the space where genuine perception returns. In that clarity, value naturally resurfaces, not because it was demanded, but because it was finally noticed. Emotional independence is one of the most misunderstood forces in human attraction. Many people believe attraction grows through constant reassurance, availability, and emotional proximity. In reality, attraction strengthens when emotional stability is self-generated rather than externally dependent. Ignoring her only works when it reflects a shift away from emotional dependence and toward internal balance. The moment your emotional state no longer rises and falls based on her responses, your presence changes in a way that is quietly noticeable. When someone is emotionally independent, they interact from choice rather than need. This distinction is subtle but powerful. Need creates pressure, even when unspoken. It shows up in over-explaining, quick replies, emotional monitoring, and the constant desire for validation. Emotional independence removes that pressure. Your communication becomes relaxed, measured, and grounded. This calmness communicates confidence without performance, and confidence rooted in stability feels safe, not forced. Another critical aspect of emotional independence is the redirection of focus. When your attention returns to your own goals, responsibilities, and personal growth, your emotional energy becomes anchored. You stop seeking meaning through another person's reactions. This anchoring creates psychological gravity. People are instinctively drawn to those who are not trying to pull them closer. Attraction forms more naturally when there is no emotional grabbing, no urgency, and no silent expectation. Ignoring in this context is not an act of withdrawal, but an act of self-alignment. You are not withholding attention to provoke a response. You are withholding overinvestment to protect your emotional clarity. This distinction determines whether silence feels mature or manipulative. Authentic emotional independence carries consistency. Your tone does not change based on outcomes. Your self-worth remains intact whether attention is returned or not. That steadiness is deeply attractive because it signals emotional leadership. There is also a psychological mirror effect at play. When you stop overgiving emotionally, the other person becomes more aware of their own level of investment. The imbalance becomes visible. Emotional independence invites reciprocity without asking for it. Instead of chasing connection, you allow it to meet you at a natural midpoint. This shift often leads the other person to engage more consciously, not because they feel pressured, but because they sense the change in emotional dynamics. True emotional independence removes the fear of losing someone, not because loss doesn't matter, but because your identity is no longer tied to the outcome. This freedom is what transforms interaction. When someone feels that you are complete without them, your presence becomes a privilege rather than an emotional requirement. Silence has a unique psychological effect because it removes external stimulation and forces the mind inward. When communication is constant, emotions remain shallow and reactive. There is no room for anticipation, reflection, or emotional processing. Ignoring her works because silence creates a pause in emotional exchange, and within that pause, feelings are no longer guided by immediate feedback. The mind begins to generate its own meaning, often amplifying emotional significance rather than diminishing it. When interaction slows or stops, the brain attempts to fill the gap. This is not speculation. It is a natural cognitive response to interrupted patterns. Thoughts return to past conversations, subtle moments, and emotional cues that previously went unnoticed. The absence becomes mentally active. Curiosity replaces certainty. Emotional questions surface without being prompted. What does this distance mean? Why does it feel different? These internal dialogues deepen emotional engagement far more than constant reassurance ever could. Silence also heightens emotional contrast. When communication resumes after distance, even small gestures feel more impactful. A brief message carries more emotional weight because it emerges from quiet rather than noise. This contrast strengthens emotional memory. Moments are felt more intensely because they are no longer diluted by repetition. Emotional depth requires space, and silence provides that space without force. Another critical function of silence is that it restores emotional ownership. Constant contact subtly shifts emotional responsibility onto the other person. Their replies regulate mood, confidence, and reassurance. Silence removes that dependency. Each person becomes responsible for their own emotional experience. In that independence, emotions become more authentic. Feelings that survive distance are stronger because they are self-generated, not maintained through constant interaction. Silence also exposes emotional investment levels. Without constant communication, it becomes clear who reaches out, who reflects, and who feels the absence. This clarity is not about judgment, but awareness. Emotional dynamics reveal themselves when noise disappears. Silence strips interaction down to its psychological core, allowing real attachment patterns to surface naturally. Most importantly, silence creates emotional gravity rather than emotional pressure. Pressure pushes people away, even when disguised as care. Gravity pulls without effort. When silence is calm, grounded, and free of resentment, it becomes emotionally compelling. It invites engagement rather than demanding it. The mind leans toward what feels composed and centered. Ignoring her works not because silence creates longing through deprivation, but because it allows emotions to breathe. In that breathing space, feelings either deepen or dissolve, and both outcomes are rooted in truth rather than emotional force. Here's the truth most people avoid. Attraction isn't created by chasing, explaining, or proving your value. It's created when your presence is chosen, not assumed. When you stop trying to control the outcome and start controlling your emotional center, silence becomes strength, distance becomes clarity, and attention becomes meaningful again. And once that shift happens, the dynamic is never the same.